So far, we prepared our scene and ourselves for starting this character rig. So for this module, we'll follow through with that and build the skeleton. We'll talk a bit about object hierarchy and how all that pertains to the joints in our skeleton system. After that, we will build the dwarf hero skeleton from start to finish, beginning with his spine, then moving on to his arms and legs. While we're working on the leg, we also want to set up the joints necessary for an inverse foot system. Once that's all done, we'll create the character's finger joints, then mirror both limbs so we aren't doing twice the work. Finally, we'll end with a simple but effective eye setup and beard system. We're about to do some pretty fancy stuff here with this character rig in the joints tool, but before we get into that, I want to make sure you understand how the joints are going to be working and how the parent-child relationship affects the whole joint structure. And to do that, I'm going to use a very simplified demonstration of a chest model with a hinged lid. So I'm going to hold space down and go to Create, and then I'm going to go up to Polygon Primitives and create Cube. And that'll make a little tiny cube in the middle of the grid. Alternatively, you could go over to the Polygons tab and simply click this cube here, and that will also make a little tiny cube. So I'm going to delete that little one and select this larger one and duplicate it with Shift D. And you'll see that we have another cube over here in the hierarchy in our outliner. I'm going to bring that up, and this will become our lid. So I'll scale it into a flatter shape. This is going to be more like a little birthday box, I guess. You can pretend it's a treasure chest because he's sort of like a fantasy warrior guy. Anyway, now I want to create a hinge, so I'm going to hold down D and V so that we have the snap to point tool activated and the free pivot movement activated at the same time. So now when I click and drag, you'll notice it snaps to the corners. So I'm going to just make this hinge over here in this corner, and now when you select the rotate tool, you can see that it hinges to open to display the present for our guy here. So undo that movement, and I'm going to just translate this down, and this time I'm just going to hold V so that as I move, it snaps to points. So now we have it butting right up against this other vertice on this box, and as we open, it looks like it's got a hinge on it. It's opening like a box. Now if our hero ever went to pick this box up, you'd imagine we just grab this and animate it moving upwards, but we lose something on the way, and that's because we haven't created a hierarchy or a parent-child relationship between these two objects yet. So what I'm going to do is simply grab the lid and put it underneath by holding down the middle mouse button and dragging in the outliner the first cube. And now you'll see that object has been nested within that parent object. This means that the parent object now controls the transforms of the top object. So when it moves around, the lid will go with it. So you can see here, now that I'm moving this big box around, the lid will follow. And if he wanted to pick it up, he could pick it up and even open it up to see what's inside there. This is a very basic example of a hierarchy chain and what we'll be creating with our joints as we create our skeleton. Basically what the main principles are parent objects, pivot points, and then children objects underneath the parents. So as we rotate the parent cube, the child will follow, and then the child can rotate independently on its own little axis. So now that we've kind of looked at that very rudimentary example of these two cubes here, I'm going to just delete it, delete the cube, the parent object, and the child goes with it. And now I'm going to do that same example using joints instead. So in the tab section here, we'll find the rigging tab, and we'll click that. And then we'll see all the rigging tools at our disposal. And the second one here is the Create Joints tool, and I want to click that. And you'll notice that our cursor has changed, indicating the tool is now active. Now what we want to do is go into the side view. So to do that, I'm just going to go to this 4-panel view, click that, and press spacebar in the side view here. And now we're looking into -X space. So now with our tool selected, I'm going to simply click once on the grid here, and you'll notice over here in the outliner that a new object has appeared, a joint has appeared. Now I'm going to move my cursor to another part of the grid and click again, and this time nothing has appeared on the top layer, but if we go underneath the first joint that we created, we'll notice that a second joint has now been nested underneath, creating that parent-child relationship that we had to do by hand with the cubes. Now I'm going to press the Q key and quit out of that tool. Alternatively, you can just hit enter and finish that tool. And I'm going to select the parent joint, this first joint here, and rotate it. And you'll see that that second joint just moves right along with it, just like you'd expect, just like we were seeing with our treasure chest example. And also, just like we'd expect, if I click the child and try to rotate it, only the child is rotating, the parent stays put. To make this a little easier to see, we can reselect the joint tool or simply hit the G key and select the last tool that we're using. And I'm going to click on this joint too, this child joint. And now when I click on the grid someplace else, it's going to continue that joint chain. And if I look under joint 2, we now have a third joint there. So I'm going to quit out of the tool again by hitting Q. And now it's a little easier to see when we rotate the parent, all these joints moving with it, as well as rotating this child, its own little child is moving with it as well. So if you imagine this as an arm sticking straight up out of the ground, like a zombie arm, and we want to move the shoulder, we can move the shoulder like this, and the hand and the wrist area over here is going to move along with it. And then we can select this elbow joint and move it, and the shoulder stays put, and the wrist moves. So that's a very basic idea of how the joints are behaving inside of a rig. To be a little clearer as to what you're actually seeing here, I'm going to mix up this hierarchy a little bit so you can kind of tell exactly what we're looking at. So a lot of people are under the assumption that this is the bone and we're controlling bones here. However, this bone in between the joints is actually just telling us that this is the parent and this is the child. And it just shows what's connecting. So when we move the child around, it stays stuck on there and we know which parent this child belongs to. Now if I select this last child joint, the joint 3, and in the outliner I middle mouse over it and place it underneath joint 1, you'll notice two things. One is the joint in the outliner is now nested alongside its former parent, the joint 2, under joint 1. And you'll also notice that this connecting bone here has moved, so now we see the relationship that we're supposed to. This joint here, joint 3, is now connected to joint 1 as its child.